I think I might take this opportunity to ask all of our panellists up. We don't actually have chairs for them. I'm wondering whether is that okay? The bench, okay. You're on the bench, guys. If you'd like to come up, please. And I've got a question to pose to you, and then I'll put it out to the audience for some other questions. So thank you. So as you're aware, well, actually Andrew alluded to it, but he didn't really give you the full detail. But we did. Yeah. Okay. So we had the challenge. We spoke before about. Simon spoke about it was very bottom up approach, and it's practitioners driving this. We were hopeful that we were going to see performance-based policy in the planning design code driving this, and there's certainly things about car park. Design and integration and infiltration and good words about the types of WUSIT elements we want to see in, but there's no performance-based policy driving the outcomes. From what your experiences at a panel, what do you think it's going to take, or what are we going to, what do we need to do as an industry, as a community, as governments, and when I say governments, I mean sort of the broader government, local government, and some state agencies who have a strong interest in this. What do you think we're going to need to do to see this type of product and these practices become mandated? So I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are. So does anyone want to start us off?
So Simon alluded to what is happening in the UK at the moment, where you can't actually physically build a car park without having permeable paving in it. It's the same with most of the subdivisional developments that they're doing over there. You talked about retention versus detention. We see up in Queensland a lot of subdivisions that are happening where we have to have either retention or detention basins. These sorts of structures could be built into the road, creating more usable land in those subdivisions. There's a lot of policies that could be put in place that would better use this particular type of product in those sorts of environments and would give us better sustainability moving forward as well. But it really needs to come down through government regulations. We get a lot of developers that go to the local councils. They've put permeable paving into their designs. The councils are reluctant to use it. They're concerned about the maintenance aspects of it. James brought up about the approved installer program that the CMAA has put together. That was actually an initiative that was developed by the CMAA to try and give some more comfort for people wanting to use paving in their developments by making sure that the installers were approved installers who knew how to install pavements properly, so that we were going to limit the amount of maintenance that might be required moving forward.
Now, there's no one that wants to be home before 6 o'clock, is there? That I fully agree with what you said. Unfortunately, I think it's very idealistic, and I think I've been beaten over the years into the practical rather than the idealistic. I've completely given up on policy. The number of development plan changes I've seen over my career where better stormwater management practices have been in them until literally, with the current code, literally the half an hour before it being signed off, a lot of stuff that was in there that was good got taken out. That is not the first time. The water quality targets were in planning codes, previous generations of planning codes, and removed at the last minute. So policy, I kind of laughed at the policy document that doesn't really present itself as a policy. That side of things, and I know there are people in government working hard at it, but they keep hitting the same brick walls. It's a political reality. I think that through capacity building, and this kind of does lead to bottom up, and I sort of alluded to in the presentation with training developers and their designers, you can get change happening through that process, and therefore providing better resources and materials and demonstrations to those people, showing them that, so part of what we've worked with Mel is trying to put stuff on people's doorstep that they can pick up and use that they know will get pre-approved. Save them actually potentially having to engage certain designers and being able to do things that way. So I believe that's probably the more practical way. And you get to a point where you change the culture. But then putting my hat back on as the council receiving things, which was alluded to before, because of some of the poor standards, and that pre-qualified installer is probably a good idea to add some of the workmanship of stuff we inherit, particularly if it's a fringe installation or infrastructure like rain gardens or permeable pavement that hasn't quite become normalised yet. It's hard enough to get the normalised stuff done right by some of the contractors doing large-scale development that we inherit with limited input from council. That's where some of that hesitation from the fringe stuff. So I think the pre-qualified, knowing who the contractor is and demonstrating they have a good skill set in doing it is probably, again, the way of breaking that barrier.
Okay. Any questions for the panel from the floor?
Some degree. The others is the heels, having that opening, loading, the actual, like the heavy vehicles. Most of our roads are quite heavily trafficked, and even the footpaths, to be honest, to some degree. The heels being the openings, that porous component, and then the appearance. So my question I had for the group is fundamentally how different are pavers from the pavers that are used for a permeable paving environment, and is there an ability to modify the way a traditional paver is installed to create it so that it's permeable?
Only because I'm unsure, but I think, is Adelaide City Council custodian of the fig tree permeable paving around Adelaide Oval?
No. So Adelaide Oval is managed by the Stadium Management Authority independently.
So that's as I alluded to with Olympic Park when I was talking about hills, the subject I'm well adverse to. Does anyone know whether Adelaide Oval has had an issue? Has Adelaide Oval come back to Adbury? I keep saying Adbury. I'm one of the guilty ones with the Adbury. Has anyone come back to Adbury and said that this is an issue? How do we rectify it?
From any people that have used either our Eco Trihex or Eco Pave products in their projects, we've never had anybody come back and talk about tripping. Slip is a big one. I know with Adelaide Council at the moment, we just did accelerated slip testing on all of our paving range for the 10,000 cycles. So even slip isn't an issue with the paving.
So where does the hills comment come from in Adelaide City? Is it?
So the heels comment is generally just a pedestrian-orientated environment. That's a concern that has been raised. But however, saying that, it's only one concern of many. And if I'm honest, the main concern is really around appearance. All the examples that I've seen today, whilst they all look lovely, use a conventional style paver of a similar size and shape. We have a plethora of different types of paving that we use within the council. Very few really apply based on what I've seen here today. And I suppose what I'm wondering is, rather than trying to go through the rigmarole of getting the types of pavers that I've seen that are permeable suitable applied in the City of Adelaide, which is hard work, am I able to continue using the pavers that we already have installed and maybe, for example, use a different mortar system or a grouting system that would facilitate water permeating around the edges or something of that nature?
In short, yes. Particularly with your larger, say, flagstone pavers. There's a few pavers out there in the market that are just a small little corner cut off. You're not going to get the infiltration that you might with, say the Eco Trihex. But little things like that will enable most of the gap to be mortared or sealed. There's lots of spaces out there on the market, but just little corner cut-offs on your pavers, that's a cheap and easy modification if you've already got your palette selected to make those modifications. Now, there'd be a bit of trial and error with that over, a proprietary product that's got all the data to back it up, but that is a way you could address those concerns.
I thought, Ashley, maybe you were putting a call out to the manufacturers to come out with something a bit of a fashion range or something.
Yeah.
No, I suppose I was more broadly speaking, rather than trying to create a paver that is permeable, can we create it so that every paver is possibly permeable?
Yeah, so you can use any paver that you're using at the moment. You install it with a widened joint, but you still want your bedding material and your base materials to be permeable graded aggregates. You don't want to be mortaring them down or grouting them, because the water isn't going to be able to penetrate that through that. But if you've got your 2 to 5 mil aggregates in your enlarged joints, you've got your 2 to 5 mil aggregate as your bedding material, and you've got your permeable base material, it will still perform the same function. You haven't got as much void capacity on the surface, so there won't be as much water passing through, but it's still going to give you that permeable aspect.
I think Simon would like to.
Just add one word of caution to that, and you touched on it at the end there. The manufacturers have put a lot of time and effort into designing their pavers, and there's a lot of data that's gone into that, and they all work. But just as importantly, they all work structurally as well. As soon as you start fiddling with a given paver, there's two things that can happen. One, you can actually reduce the strength of the paver, but two, you can actually reduce the locking effect, which is very, very carefully designed. As soon as you lose that locking, it's down to the paver taking a lot of the load. The paver itself, providing it's thick enough, and we traditionally in Australia use 80mm pavers, which is plenty strong enough for most applications. The only time you'd ever go to a 100mm paver, which was a couple of my case studies had 100mm in there, is for those Howland hook type terminals. You wouldn't need them even in commercial in Australia. So the 80mm paver is fine, but it's not the paver that's taking the load. The paver is sharing the load with all the pavers around it and transferring it down to the base course. As soon as you mix that up a bit, you could have the paver taking the load, and that could be an issue. So just a word of caution if you start fiddling around. I don't see the point, to be honest. There are so many designs out there that you can purchase. They all, some of them look like traditional pavers. I'd probably err on the... I never err on the conservative side, but here I would probably err slightly on the conservative side.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I'm the CEO of CMAA, and we actually had this situation in Hobart. And all I can say is please talk to us and our manufacturers, because the more bluestone that is imported from China for councils doesn't help us create beautiful different design with our pavers. And we worked with them and what they wanted to aesthetically achieve, and I think that we can do it as an industry. We're really passionate about it, and I think all of our manufacturers do come together to really try to make it work. So we have heard that before, but we're here to try and help.
Question for the CMAA. I'm going to go back to the high heels. How many high heels issues have you come across?
I have not come across any, and I actually live in Sydney. I've been out to Sydney Olympic Park many a time, and I wear them. But I feel like it's an urban myth. But I'm going to do a Margaret Thatcher and say, give me the names and the numbers of all the complaints that we've had, because, we actually were just talking about it today, weren't we, Simon? And, we don't know where it's come from. But, yes, please give me their names. And
Okay, Catherine, we've just got a question over here, please.
Hi, my name's Adam. I'm from the City of Adelaide. I really like the Tri-Hex paver, by the way. I think it's beautiful. One question I get quite often is about slumping. What would you say to someone who has... There's quite a few projects up there which have been there for a while. Have you guys had an issue with that? And what would you say to someone who is concerned about slumping?
To be quick, for the first time in my life, I think it's probably not too dissimilar to general brick paving. That if you have a bit of a soft base, it'll reflect through. If you have some workmanship issue with a patch, it'll reflect through. I mentioned it out there. I think I tend to align it not to traffic load, because I've seen different performance in different localities where there isn't a commonality of theme there. I put it down more to workmanship, or a sub base that's been missed or something along the lines of that. I don't see it being any more or less problematic than conventional pavers do it.
Hi, I'm Beck again. I have a few questions from some of the councils I represent. One is about over-engineering and what is enough in terms of the base that's required. We've heard a lot about geofabric and the myths there, so that's good. I guess part of that is I've never heard about this, the design perm design software before, and I'm not sure how many councils use it. But is that the way in which you can essentially do that? And without that kind of software, how does one know what's enough?
Where do I start? So over designing, pretty much it comes from the absence of data, pretty much. Absence of geotechnical data, absence from existing environment data. The reason why they're over designing is because of that. I don't know, does Simon
Totally agree.
want to chip in?
I agree with everything James said there, but the bottom line is you've now got a tool like Design Pave which takes a lot of the hard graft out. You do still have to provide some field data if you've got it. So for instance, you were talking about slumpings, you probably want the CBR of your subgrade and a few other things. So there's software tools out there that you can use that should completely reduce your time in the design stage and allow you to then use that time creatively to come up with a good design, an aesthetic design that Ashley was talking about, and other things. So, and that's where I think the focus can be to a large extent now, because the actual engineering side of things, to a certain degree, is almost on a plate for you with the software.
If I can just add on to that, much like Andrew touched on, it depends what the purpose is. There's infiltration, there's detention, that can often govern how thick your pavement profile is. So that over-engineering depends purely on the purpose.
Thank you. Tim from Mitcham. My question follows on with that one quite well. Some of the section drawings we've seen has specified compacted subgrade 95, 98, 100%. Arlene's at the start specified uncompacted subgrade. The 40 millimetre pond in Kirkcaldy, I've seen that often when the subgrade is compacted, it reduces your infiltration. And compaction stifles the tree root growth, which increases infiltration orders of magnitude. Why do some designs still specify compaction, and how can we stop compacted subgrade being specified when Design Pave allows us to put in a low strength saturated CBR of a few percent? How do we get away from compacted subgrade?
I knew you'd catch that, Tim. So one thing I would say is a lot of those designs, cross sections I showed up there, they're 10 to 20 years old. So we have come a long way since then. There's been a lot of education and research on that. So a lot of the newer designs, in Charles Sturt especially, they don't have that compacted subgrade.
Where the building are right at the edge of the lane. Now we're talking about infiltration. I'm wondering whether you did analyze the impact of the water, right, which is detained underneath on the buildings.
Yeah, so for a lane which is in between two big buildings, we have to make sure that the pavement is actually sloping away from the side of the wall, mainly because we want to reduce as much hydrostatic pressure as we can.
The other simple thing to that question is, what are you trying to achieve? Because you can eliminate any moisture movement if it's fully sealed and you're trying to get the benefits out of a fully sealed system, or you're redirecting the water somewhere else. And similarly, if your storage volume versus the amount of water that gets there, if you take an unsealed area and make it all permeable with paving, you haven't changed the scenario of a location. So it comes down to what you're trying to achieve and what variant of a permeable system you utilise.
Hello, Martin again. Just a question which comes from some of our pavement guys. Most of Adelaide has highly reactive clays, and if you're not lining these systems and you don't want to line them to get the infiltration benefits, how on earth do you design for soil movement?
Well, no, just to give Martin an answer, it is one of the big issues. For example, if we bring it back to development status, there's a plan. I can't remember the correct term. A planning direction note or something similar to that on infiltration on sites. And what's interesting is it talks about infiltration but doesn't. How do you define infiltration? And this is potentially where we need to play with terminology of permeable. To me, infiltration is where you concentrate runoff from a larger area into a focus area and basically supersize the saturation of the soils around it, maximising your differential movement of reactive soils. if you've got, and I sort of come back to I flippantly threw away the grass comment, but if you actually have grass off the side of a building, no one gets overly excited about its impact on a footing. If you make that grassed area 2 parking spaces that are all permeable paved, and it all soaks in with no other water coming to that permeable surface, I don't think that's infiltration as that code defines it. And one of the things I want to work on through Water Sensitive SA is actually reframing the definition and description of that so that we can actually get more permeable uptake in development, because I have developers arguing with me at the moment that they have approved developments with permeable driveways, and now they're throwing out this planning note saying that, oh no, that's infiltration and you can't have it on a reactive site, which is much of Adelaide. So I think if you do have massive amounts coming in and soaking in, then you have to design it as if it was an infiltration trench with no permeable. You know, it's the same challenges as an infiltration trench or an infiltration system. It needs to be engineered in that manner.
It's like to offer an answer, if I may. Part of my PhD was to look at ground movement in response to infiltration through permeable paving in moderately reactive clay up in Kingswood here. We published on it just last year. The difference between impervious and pervious pavement was marginal. There was a difference, but it was insignificant compared to the overall average movement. Where you had trees nearby extracting water, infiltration through permeable paving reduced ground movement. There was less movement with infiltration. It's offsetting the extraction. Where there were no trees, the movement was slightly greater. We think that's the only published paper so far. It's preliminary, it's rigorous. I can get you a copy of the paper. There's an unpublished report done in the city of Charles Sturt actually about 20 years ago by UniSA to do with infiltration trenches on 2 opposite sides of the building. The monitoring was the measurement of the footings on the building. One side had lawn which had an infiltration trench installed, and all the water off the roof was soaked into the infiltration trench. The other side had a sealed car park. Movement where there was a sealed car park, no infiltration, was big seasonal movement which exceeded the design spec for that footing every year. The other side where there was infiltration, there were more peaks and troughs, but they were all within the design spec. So infiltration reduced the movement there. We've just analysed some data on tree net inlets, looking at ground movement at the curb, on top of the inlet, and midway between. This is in the street where Harsha did her research. So the distances between vary. We used a generalised linear method stats to account for the variation along the street, and there was no difference in ground movement on top of a tree net inlet at the curb or midway between the inlets with no infiltration. So no difference whatsoever. Now these inlets, we've got another project going at UniSA, Hussein, Shazad and Baden-Myers, looking at how much they harvest over a year. Average 1 year was 4,500 litres, right in behind the curb, and no difference in ground movement. And another year was 1,800 kilolitres with no difference in movement. And tree net inlets have just been installed as part of the Springbank doors alignment on a major arterial. Will you see any problem? No, because we'll be introducing some trees behind them. Thanks.
Okay, 2 parts. The first part is probably something for mulling over. If infill development always expands impervious area, when approval is given, should not that trigger councils to make an equivalent impermeable area pervious, as well as support replacement trees? So that's just food for thought. But I think that, you know, with an offset scheme, systems such as permeable pavements would have an offset that would be available to them.
Yeah,
If I just piggyback off of that, I know that Brisbane City Council right now, and as well as Ku-ring-gai Council in New South Wales, has a pervious offset. So if you use permeable paving around maybe like 100 square meters, per square meter you'll get $10 back. So Brisbane City Council and Ku-ring-gai Council are all leading the front in that regard. But yeah, that should definitely be pushed into other councils as well. I highly suggest that you guys push that.
Thank you. And one further one is just to add to they say perm pave. Could gravel bed overflows from beneath permeable pavements be used for ASR, allowing credit for groundwater allocations that councils would take up? I've just done a quick calculation to say that you'd need about 100,000 or 10 hectares of permeable pavement to make it worthwhile to do an ASR scheme to the confined aquifers beneath Adelaide. But for unconfined aquifers, about 0.4 of a hectare would be all that you would need. And that would make it pay for itself. So I guess maybe there could be some look at the PermPave software as to whether you could increase or make provision for the excess water from permeable paving to go into aquifer storage and recovery, and then maybe you could turn your 1 in 5 year ARIs that you're managing into 1 in 100 year ARIs.
The only thing I'd say to that, I've always had permeable pavement like tree net inlets as, and this is not derogatory, but it's a process which is a death by 1,000 cuts or success by 1,000 gold stars. It's mass install, cumulative over time, not normally what I would equate with any degree of parallel to a harvest wetland that sits at them. I guess I'm kind of struggling how smaller jobs, if Westfield Marion was going to go and resurface their entire site and do it in permeable, and wanted to throw an MAR on something like that, that might be the scale that might be needed to potentially warrant, to give that warrant. The streetscape examples, like most of us have shown, or a small commercial development car park, I don't think would have the justification for the spend needed to get the water down deep, unless I'm missing something.
Okay, I think we are at the end of the day. Thank you so much to our panel. I'd like you to help me thank them.